consciousness is a philosophical term that has never been precisely defined and has therefore always remained vague. The reason is that philosophers, as a rule, refuse to accept that life originated from matter and that it, of course, also operates according to substances and laws. They wanted to see in humans a being that, beyond the material realm, possesses metaphysical states and experiences, particularly through its consciousness, and that has free will. These are desires that cannot be fulfilled by facts, by reality, but are possible with the midpoint mechanic. In other words, this blinds them and thus fulfills their illusions. A clear, real definition of consciousness is obtained when it is described with heightened attention, whose function is to examine something more closely. This avoids the subliminal implication of metaphysics. It arises with the senses, sensory perception, when certain thresholds are crossed. These, of course, immediately activate all affected neural networks in order to react. Sensory perception is the reception and transmission of environmental stimuli and bodily states. This heightened awareness, due to a lack of information, cannot plan on its own. The human mind, as an information seeker within neural networks, can only contribute partial information through its activities. Ultimately, decisions are concerted results from many neural networks, aimed at achieving goals. The belief that we control ourselves with our consciousness is rarely questioned because it has been handed down and our feelings impose it with apparent certainty. Thus, we generally experience ourselves as individuals who make all decisions. The brain is seen as a tool, the repository of memory. Furthermore, it is acknowledged that inherited predispositions and learned skills are stored here. It is often less clear that it also regulates all feelings, thoughts, actions, and so on. Because if you look more closely, you can realize that only the brain, which also contains the self, i.e., its goals, guides us. This is an essential partner and decision maker. For normal, daily life, however, it is usually irrelevant to know that the brain controls us. We act and react to events that are important to us. But it can be interesting for anyone who wants to know why consciousness exists. 1. The brain presents the world to us according to its goals. It is common knowledge that it selects the world. 2. General attention sees it in this form, plus what the senses additionally perceive. 3. This modified image is sent back to the brain. If the brain decides that the information is important, for example, because essential correlations are missing, heightened attention is generated in the senses. 4. These then show us the world, which may have changed, and store it. 5. The heightened attention now sees it in this form, plus what the senses then perceive in addition. 6. It sends this information back to the brain. 7, etc. These sequences repeat themselves constantly, every millisecond, depending on the importance, with normal attention or with heightened senses. So, what we see initially is first created exclusively by the brain, which presents it to us based on its objectives. Then, the sensory experience is sent to the brain, which processes it. And, depending on the deviation, attention then sees a corrected view. Therefore, it is only perceived milliseconds after the brain has made its decision. Because the brain always decides, since it holds countless pieces of information, according to its objectives. Consciousness, the heightened attention, never decides, because it is only perceiving and very limited in what it can simultaneously receive from the brain. And only with sufficient information can appropriate decisions be made. It follows very clearly from this that consciousness, that is, normal attention, cannot adequately interpret the world for decision-making because this is the domain of the brain. It does not possess its information. The brain cannot experience the present clearly enough without sensory information. It needs this information to potentially correct its interpretation of the world and make different decisions. In summary, the senses thus experience the world according to the parameters of our goals and send differing results to the neural networks. This information is then received and processed in the brain. Again, consciousness, of course, does not decide. The brain decides according to its internal goals. If it receives no current information from the outside, it can only judge based on what it already knows. Ultimately, it's about perception. Either normal, more general perception, such as moving through a familiar environment, or attentive, conscious perception through heightened senses, e.g., when in an unfamiliar area. Perception, therefore, has the task of providing the brain with information through experience. This can generate new learning processes, lead to corrections, changes in attitudes, activation of goals, and so on. The brain formulates suggestions, anticipates or rejects them, thus preempting results, which perception experiences, and transmits the resulting perspectives and information back to the brain, which then evaluates the outcome. When something is currently important to us, something dangerous, unusual, or new occurs, or when decisions or activities of neural networks exceed a certain threshold in the brain, it heightens our senses. This allows us to perceive the external and internal world more intensely. We experience it more vividly. The heightened senses, through perception, then send the received information to the brain, especially to the affected neural networks, which, largely through their emotions, may change their assessment and attitude. This result is then perceived again, and so on. Feelings offer solutions to a problem based on similar past events. If, for example, one decides on a different solution because of heightened attention to the current issue, one may experience a bad feeling in one's gut. This arises because one did not adopt the decision made in another, similar situation. As mentioned, this occurs due to similar events in the past. It does not, of course, prove with irrefutable facts that a different decision regarding the current situation is wrong, because the two are generally not identical. Consciousness is not something supernatural, but simply perception. It is gained through concentration on a goal, which activates the relevant midpoint with its neural network. If you ask what consciousness is, the answer is often, consciousness is the brain's perception, which enables the self to make decisions. This raises two questions. 1. How is perception achieved? 2. What is the self? Wikipedia Encyclopedia, perception, also called sensation, is, in living beings, the process and the subjective result of acquiring, receiving, and processing information from stimuli from the environment and from within the body. This occurs through unconscious, and in humans, sometimes conscious, filtering and combining partial pieces of information into subjectively meaningful overall impressions. These are also called percepts and are continuously compared with stored ideas, constructs and schemas. Regarding 1, in order to be able to filter subjectively, goals are needed that guide the acquisition of information. Regarding 2, here, too, these are the goals of the individual that they want to achieve. Filled right pointing pointer definition, the self initially develops from feelings, what do I like, what don't I like. Over time, this changes to, I want this, I don't want that. In all cases, these are goals. Filled right pointing pointer definition, human drives are the goals in the brain that, like everything in the universe, operate according to laws. How did they originate? Through heredity, or over the course of life, and they form neural networks in the brain. The question of how stimuli from the environment are received is obvious, by the senses. A selection process already takes place here. It is impossible to perceive all the stimuli that surround us and are constantly changing. Wikipedia Encyclopedia, filtering stimuli is the central prerequisite for survival in the environment for all animals, and to some extent also for single-celled organisms and plants. Every living being is constantly bombarded with significantly more stimuli than its sensory cells or cell components and the cells that support them could potentially process. This means that at this fundamental level, a selection process already takes place based on the goals that are important to a person. They, unconsciously, direct their attention toward these goals. Thus, we constantly encounter goals that shape a person. Compared to this, we notice little of what our normal attention takes in. Information from the senses, sensory perception, is generally unconscious. However, as soon as something becomes very important, attention is intensified. And this is precisely where consciousness comes into play. Filled right pointing pointer definition, consciousness is heightened sensory perception, the reception and transmission of environmental stimuli and bodily states that exceed certain thresholds. Filled right pointing pointer. Since even experts lack a clear definition of the psyche, I propose the following. The psyche consists of the neuronal networks in the brain. Filled right pointing pointer. At this point, it is fundamental to understand my term, midpoint, which shapes the psyche. It refers to a network of neurons that develops in order to achieve a goal. The more intensely the brain pursues a goal, the less other goals that cannot contribute to it are perceived or can have an effect. This is the general wiring pattern of the brain. Filled right pointing pointer. And finally, textbooks, unfortunately, generally do not teach the central motives of living beings, their goals. Humans drive are the aims in the brain. I have noticed that it is difficult for many psychologists and philosophers to understand that humans are guided by neural networks. They still assume that they control themselves with their consciousness, which is also supposed to be their self. This attitude can be described as a dogmatic veil, the tendency of many academics not to be skeptical of their own theory. The term dogmatism describes the belief that certain irrefutable, certain opinions and statements exist. This applies particularly to the concept of mind, which is also vaguely described as a mental state. Ultimately, it is meant to represent something intangible. This stems from the field of metaphysics, synonym, ontology, whose foundations are faith and speculation, with the aim of portraying humankind as something that also portrays it as a creature of a non-physical world. Ultimately, this has been produced without sufficient evidence by people giving voice to their wishful thinking. This attitude is often associated with the notion that these beliefs do not need to be proven. Dogmatism eludes all criticism and, regardless of what others say, whatever developments may occur, unwaveringly clings to its supposedly correct feelings. And, often, its proponents are unaware that they are dogmatists. The behavior of these people today is similar to that of the past. With the Copernican system, the geocentric worldview, the Earth being at the center of the universe, prevented the realization of the heliocentric worldview. The Earth is merely a planet revolving around the Sun. The leading intellectual class of the time could not, and would not, let go of this ingrained conception, the geocentric worldview. It only faded away in subsequent generations. The current view of consciousness is similar. It is not something that makes decisions and directs the brain, but rather it is controlled by the brain, which, driven by its objectives, activates the senses accordingly so that consciousness, or rather, perception, experiences with heightened senses and provides further information. A brief note on our senses. The brain can only perceive the world through the senses. They thus establish the connections to the world, but the vision is limited from the outset by the brain and its objectives. That is to say, they do not perceive the world as a whole, but only what is essential for the brain's objectives. This saves time and is more efficient than if the senses were to take in everything first, which wouldn't even be possible. Conclusion: general, or conscious, attention sends the received information to the neural networks that process it. These networks then change attitudes, behavior, and so on, if the information is relevant. The outdated view of consciousness, which posits that the mind knows everything and then makes decisions based on its ego, is no longer tenable. Furthermore, absolutely no one has yet been able to define the functions of this consciousness. However, this is possible without contradiction, given the postulate of the goals that form neural networks.